What I noticed was two things. All the President's Club, as we call it, were talking at the beginning before President Trump and Melania came in. And they were reminiscing. I saw at one point Hillary Clinton was talking to Lynn Cheney. It was very friendly. There was a lot of chit-chat going on. But when President Trump and Melania came in, it was starkly different. President Obama shook his hand. Michelle Obama, former First Lady, said good morning. And that was it.
And then turned and looked forward.
And there was the others did not greet him. Former President George W. Bush, the son, went over and shook his hand when he came. But there was a stark contrast, and there is no question. I think no one is surprised about that.
And they're showing the images of what you were just describing, so we can see it again.
And
there's one other thing I want to point out.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton. She never looked to her right.
No.
Ever. Look, I mean.
And President Clinton, who shakes everybody's, hand, he did not.
It's tough.
Reach over. Jimmy Carter down at the end, who's actually had more kind words at times for President Trump, didn't look down. So that was very different. I think the other thing that no doubt will be discussed is, while President Trump's name was never said in any of the speeches, the tributes to former President Bush, every word, every adjective, every anecdote stood in stark contrast to this presidency. And I think we're going to be talking a lot about
exactly.
that.
Exactly. And I genuinely don't think it was intentional at this funeral.
No,
I think it was just describing the late president, the 41st president, and it is what it is.
Correct. In making the tribute,
yeah.
It was another time, another person, and it couldn't have been more stark.
Thank you, Jamie. Sure. Anderson, back to you.
Dana, thanks very much. David Gergen, as we watched that picture of all the presidents, I was watching former President Obama in this image, and I couldn't help but we've all been in situations where we're in an awkward seat and sort of awkwardness is happening around us. He seems to, maybe I'm projecting onto it, but he seems to kind of have almost a slight smile on his face, sort of aware of the awkwardness that he is in the buffer position here.
I think that's true. And it was remarkable just to his left, the Clintons and everybody else looking straight ahead, not paying any attention as if sort of but I think precedent for all of them, even though it was an awkward moment, this was really more about George H.W. Bush than it was about about Trump. And I think they kept their emphasis there. And I must say, from my perspective, the four eulogies were the finest we've heard in political memory. Right from the first moment when John Meacham stood up and told that riveting story of how Bush was shot down out of the skies and was waiting there, and he was miraculously rescued, but he lost his two men. And he asked that question, why was I spared? And he spent the rest of his life seeking an answer to that through service. Right from that first moment to the last moment, when George W. Bush choked up and said, what my father wanted to do was to go back and hug Robert again and hold Barbara's hand again. I mean, even now, just telling the story, it's moving.
Yeah, and also the minister who was with the family when the president passed, telling about James Baker,
yes,
massaging the feet of the president. You could see Baker crying, understandably, but I mean, such an intimate, personal moment. It was extraordinary to hear that, I thought.
They were best pals, and were so for years, because when Baker lost a child, the Bushes turned to him and they became friends and became tennis partners and the like. But I think that Jim Baker would also be uncomfortable comparing that to the last days of Christ and the washing of the feet. That's just not who he is. But he was a steadfast friend.
By the way, the hearse just passing the World War II memorial that you see there on the mall.
No, he's the guy who snuck in the gray goose.
And the steak from Morton's.
They went hunting with him.
Tim, I'm wondering what stood out to you.
Well, I think that powerful image of George H.W. Bush surviving the crash and then thinking about what to do with the rest of his life. Everyone, each of the four eulogists talked about his service. I was struck by the fact that George H.W. Bush was the chief architect of a world that is being dissolved now. He is the chief architect of the revitalization of NATO, of the revitalization of the United Nations, of NAFTA, all of the key parts of the post-Cold War world that George H.W. Bush believed were necessary to keep the peace and make the world prosperous. It was beautiful to see that reminder. It was powerful. And I wondered, as that was being said, what certain members of the audience, those listening, might have thought about the celebration of a world, I would argue, that will not go away, but a world that is now under deep pressure. That was George H.W. Bush's legacy. Not just the humanity, not just the decency, not just the dignity, but actual changes in our world. And I think celebrating that today was important.
Mary Kate, as a speechwriter, I'm sure you're listening closely.
So years ago when President Ford died, President Bush gave a eulogy like we just heard just now. And my children went to the National Cathedral School and knew all the choir boys. And the choir boys had a vote and voted that President Bush gave the best eulogy. So I sent him a note and said, hey, congratulations, you won the choir boy vote. And he wrote me back and he said, overwhelmed am I, Mary Kate. Imagine a guy like me winning the vote of the National Cathedral Choir Boys regarding my eulogy for President Ford. And I think, I'm sure when President Bush gave that eulogy, he was thinking about what can young people learn from President Ford. And you may recall, Ford's funeral, there were Boy Scouts as ushers. So there were a lot of young people in the audience at the time. And I thought so many times today, what can young people learn from George Bush from this ceremony? I think there probably were a lot of young people watching because I assume some of the schools were closed or schools had them watch it. And the things that jumped out to me were decency, loyalty, humor, love, the high road to humility, as Alan Simpson said, and a man who believed in things larger than himself. Many young people want to believe in something larger than themselves. And then, as John Meacham put it, making sure that the lives of others are freer, better, warmer, and nobler. Russ Levinson, at the end there of his eulogy, said, that he didn't think this should be an end to an era. And I've thought that a lot lately. Everybody keeps saying it's the end of an era, and that's kind of bothering me. He said it should be instead an invitation to fill the hole that is left behind. And that's the biggest message to young people is don't see this as something that's never coming back. View this as an invitation to be just like George Bush.
But that era, that generation of people who saw service as an integral, as just kind of a given, I mean, that it does harken back to another time. I mean, you look at, again, he didn't have to go into World War II when he did. Right. I mean, he could have stayed at Yale and, played baseball and done all the things that a lot of other people.
One of the things we have to come to grips with is the effect of losing the World War II generation on our politics. One of the things that's striking about George Bush is he did not like ideologies. He didn't like inflexibility. He was a pragmatist. Look, he was a moderate conservative Republican, and he was uncomfortable when people didn't give, when they didn't seek compromise.
But the parties, the truth of the matter is that what is going on in our country now is that the Bush Party, the Bush Republican Party is gone, and the Trump Republican Party is dominant. And I think that this is the struggle that is underlying what we saw today without it being mentioned. And I think the message from today is neither one has to go away completely. No. You don't need to vanquish the values of a Bush to have some of the politics or the policies, if you will, of what Trump wants. And it doesn't have to be a world war.
It's interesting, Tim, you made a point about the world, the international order that President George H.W. Bush presided over, held together. And Brian Mulroney, the Canadian Prime Minister, former Canadian Prime Minister, talked about being together Labor Day 2001, this serenity that the Bushes felt about their personal lives, about where they were. Of course, this is just about 10 days before 9/11, when a lot of that international order collapsed, and it was his own son who, as president, challenged a lot of the things that President Bush 41 stood for as a diplomat astride the world stage. And that tension, president to president, different generations on either side of an act of terror, were really striking.
I want to go back to the World War II generation point, because I think it is important to clearly define George H.W. Bush's life. That is, we had 7 presidents in a row, starting with John F. Kennedy, coming through George Bush Sr., who were the World War II presidents. All came of age during World War II. Every single one of those presidents wore a military uniform. 6 of them were in the war. Only Jimmy Carter, he was in the Naval Academy when the war ended, and he went on to serve